EdMedia Exposers. Welcome to the inaugural EdMedia EXPO Debate. Really excited. Today's overarching topic is one of openness versus privacy. So a scale, a balance, tilting back and forth. Are you ready for a battle of the death? Yeah! All right, as Lisa mentioned, we have two wonderful guests here, and I know they are ready to take us into the danger zone. So the format of the debate, as mentioned at the very beginning here by Lisa, but I'll go into a little more in depth. The format of the debate will be 2 3-round bouts. The first round, the issue, is where I will introduce the issue to be debated. Each debater will then have 3 minutes to advance his or her position. Round 2, which is called the rebate, is where each debater has an opportunity to respond and counter to the previous person's arguments. And finally, we have the third round, which is the last word, which is where each of the guests, as mentioned, will drop their persona and respond as themselves to questions, some of which will be selected from the back channel, which will be monitored by Shantala and Jason, and better known as Twitter. And I will offer a short summary, this being the last word. So if everybody is ready, I will ring the bell and unleash the dogs of war. More like puppies of collegial discussion. So, whereas open educational resourcing exists, should anything be private on the internet? Be it resolved that open educational resources are like kittens. Everybody likes them. Alec Couros insists that OERs have done for knowledge what Katniss Everdeen did for the Panem citizens in the Hunger Games. It's liberated them from its evil overlords and set it on a path to freedom. So, Alec, you have 3 minutes to begin your summary, and go.
Have you ever seen a newborn kitten? Just a tiny ball of fur, pure, innocent, untainted by a cruel world. Kittens do not judge. They're even born blind. Kittens are equally opportunity cuddlers. They will snuggle up to whoever is giving love and petting and chin scratching. Kittens don't discriminate. Knowledge and truth, on the other hand, they aren't much like newborn kittens. These two fellows can see all right, and they've cozied right up to the biggest, baddest, most powerful, slick-talking Donald Trump look-alike at the country club. As Foucault would say, yeah, that's right, I'm quoting Foucault. Truth is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint. It's all relative, and it's all about who you know. Truth and knowledge are not innocent or unjudging. They are so wrapped up in the tentacled arms of power and corporate brainwashing that we all have a hard time even seeing them for what they are, let alone prying them loose. Enter our hero, the just, non-judgmental kitten, aka the mighty OER. Luckily, our kitten, like OER, not only is just and fair, but it also has claws. And it's here to save the day. Like a knight in shining armor, the brave and dashing Sir OER has come to liberate truth and knowledge from the shackles of huge textbook corporations in a daring bid to make educational materials actually relevant to learners, and to help us see that perhaps there is more to certain stories and truths than businesses would like to see less to believe. A brave, risky quest, indeed. With the help of our hero, we will no longer, the poor girl in rural Saskatchewan, suffer through the one-size-fits-all, but we really need one-size-fits-all Ontario stock textbook story about the height of the CN Tower. She'll calculate the height of grain elevators instead. And will some of the educational materials be potentially less incredible? Sure, but that's the price of choice. I'd take democracy with some less than stellar candidates over dictatorship any week. The real problem here is not OERs. It's that people are resistant to change. They like what they already know. In the 1800s, to get a block of ice, some poor worker had to chop it off from a frozen lake or pond, then it would transported by boat, train, or wagon to some far-off locale. Talk about a lot of effort. And yet, when refrigerated ice became artificially produced in the 1900s, there was protest that it was unsafe, potentially typhoid bearing, perhaps created by witchcraft. I mean, it's unnatural, isn't it? Magically frozen water. And change in anything tech-related is especially prone to Illuminati-type conspiracy theories. The telegraph was thought to be too fast for the truth. Telephones would create a race of left-eared people who'd lost hearing in their right ears from listening to the phone. Television would be used to spy on us from our living rooms. Like all fears of new and innovative, this too shall pass. And what about professors and other educators who worry about intellectual property rights and the appropriation of our precious resources? As David Wiley would say, being open is about overcoming that inner 2-year-old who constantly screams, "Mine, you can't have it, it's mine." And honestly, we'd be fools to believe that our resources are still ours when they belong to a massive textbook publisher Really, our brave knight, Sir OER, has done the hard work of reclaiming knowledge from the corporations who have long ruled over lowly serf-like academics. So instead of bemoaning our fate, we should be telling our inner 2-year-old to shut it and thanking our kind liberator, the OER.
Excellent. Thank you. Good work. Good work, Alec. So, in counter to that, let us recognize that Julia believes that navigating the OER landscape is like NASA trying to navigate through space debris. Maybe like DARPA, we should be designing harpoons, nets, and umbrella-shaped devices to skim the useless materials. Julia, you have 3 minutes to present your statement, and go.
Kittens, they're cute until they start defecating on the floor or sinking their claws into your chest. It's all a matter of perspective. Do OERs occasionally have some useful materials? You bet. But we're dealing with the infinite monkey theorem here. Get enough people banging away on their keyboards, contributing content, and you'll eventually get something usable. So everybody and their brother, mother, sister, cousin, mother's cousin twice removed is generating content and spewing it out into cyberspace like so much space junk. Like retired NASA scientist Donald Kessler says, we've lost control of the environment. Who wants to comb through all the nonsense to get to the good stuff? Where's the quality control? Where's the vetting? Who do we trust? And how do we determine that? The average instructor, professor, teacher doesn't have time to read 1,000 inertia lesson plans for Physics 101. Is that good use of our time? So our professor creates her own lesson resource, and it's gotta be good, right? So she posts it as an OER for the world. What about self-publishing vanity factors? I must be good, right? I put my stuff online and it's had like 10 views. Who even bothers to critique this stuff? Maybe academics should treat OER content like the general public treats selfies. Hey, Melissa, I saw that media object you posted for Physics 101 the other day. It seemed a bit off, if you know what I mean. Had a lot of excess content, irrelevant graphics and side jokes that distracted students from the meat of your content. For some, that self-publication can become an obsession. Hey, look at me. Look at how many OERs I've contributed to the WWW. According to Psychology Today, selfies make us look self-indulgent and attention-seeking. We're either narcissists or have liquidated our self-esteem. And what are the implications for your relationships with your colleagues if you overshare? Some research indicates your relationships will be shallow. Others just won't relate well to you if you overshare.
Wow, under time. Good work. This day and age. All right, well, that brings us to the end of the first round, the issue round. And now we're going to move into round 2, the rebate, in which each of our distinguished debaters get to debate each other's previous statements. So, in keeping things regular, let's start with Alec and Couros again.
All right. My colleague here is trying to trick all of you. She's trying to throw you off by comparing OERs to selfies and claiming that self-publishing is an act of vanity that leads to worthless resources. This can mean one of two things. At worst, she's telling you that your self-published work, like that of everyone else's, is as worthless as a poorly lit selfie taken by someone with Tyrannosaurus-length arms. At best, she's appealing to your inner 2-year-old, flattering you with the suggestion that your work, unlike all the rest, is quite frankly too good to be shared. So you should clutch it tightly to your bosom and defend it with your life. But the issue is not so black and white. Some OERs are good, and some are not so good. Esteemed audience members, let us not paint the whole world with the stroke of a single brush. But still, my colleague claims that the majority of OERs are worthless, that it's only by dint of mighty miracle, the kind of miracle that occurs in theoretical exercises of probability, such as the infinite monkey theorem, that anything of use is ever produced. Certainly not all OERs will be masterpieces. I admitted that myself. But using that as an excuse to rely on corporate textbook creators, it smacks of laziness, of an unwillingness to sort through materials to find the best ones. Fellow academics, have we sunk so low? Are we so downtrodden and defeated that we'd rather have a potentially subpar, mass-produced textbook handed to us, nay, forced upon us, than to take the time to choose from the available options themselves? Are we so selfish that are governed by our inner 2-year-old that we are unwilling to share our work? Work, I might add, that has been funded by taxpayer dollars, but instead choose to put it in the hands of greedy corporations. This is a sad day indeed.
All right. Wow. Call to arms for Alec Couros over there. And so, to further along the debate, Now it is Julia's turn to respond.
OERs are as value neutral as politics or religion. In some respects, they are a Pan-Am. Countries have OER policies or are in the midst of developing them. Who's making this stuff? Whose values does it carry? UNESCO reported that a significant amount of OER creation was institutionally driven or publicly funded. Governments and funding bodies have agendas all their own. Even the license of choice can become a political issue. UNESCO says Asia and the Pacific seem most concerned with which license is used, and some countries have gone as far as specifying the particular type of Creative Commons license that will be used. Are OERs liberating? It's hard to see the privilege when you're firmly ensconced as the entitled. With most global efforts reportedly focused on tertiary education, how does a student make it that far? Do you know that about 20% of Canadian homes don't have internet access? Look at connectivity on Aboriginal reserves in BC, and the disconnected numbers more than double, falling far short of the all-important last mile. Add in factors like less than a high school diploma and poverty, and you're not looking at the folks that OERs are reaching. The costs are hidden devices, technology, and access. Those costs are replacing the cost of textbooks with the hook of free content. It's sort of like the hidden costs of free social media, where we trade our personal data and behavioral profiling for access to these free tools.
All right, wow, who would have thought there was so much hidden cost in free? Well, that was excellent, really good counter debates, you guys. That's going to bring us now to the third round, the last word. And we will open up by having a few questions that I have prepared. Do we have any Twitter questions at the moment?
Not yet.
Awesome.
Lots of comments.
Lots of comments. People who might be watching online, if you please, or people in the audience, you feed them through Twitter. It's really fun. But we'll start here with a couple of questions here. So leading off here, Alec, I have a question for you. What, in your opinion, now as Alec Couros, not the persona, but the man, what would you say are the greatest benefits of developing and supporting OERs in higher education?
So I think one of the biggest pieces of this is really just establishing that gift economy, reclaiming it, I think, in many ways. I think we spent a lot of time. I mean, personally, I've signed a open access oath. So I only work, in my particular case, and it seems to be fairly easy in my field, certainly, to be able to publish only and to review only for open access journals. And this is something that I've taken on myself, and I actually kind of find it nice when I can say no to a particular article review on particular philosophical views. So I think one of the biggest things is less about the artifacts themselves, but really when we start to look at how we are starting to look at content, how do we look at knowledge, and moving us back to a place where I think we used to be much more reliant on ourselves, that knowledge was the center of the institution, and we're not simply just giving it away. And I think that's one of the biggest parts of OERs for me. Less about them themselves, but the movement they represent.
So yeah, that concept of liberation that you were talking about, right? Being able to make stuff available no matter, and to build upon. It seems like there's
Absolutely. I mean, the remix piece, whether they're remixed or not, I think that's really an important piece. It's the idea that they could be remixed, and that we allow for this, and we have the affordability, or there's sort of the technological affordances within these particular pieces. I think that's a really big movement, and I think we've come along. Well, we used to be much more like that, I think, right. In the academy, and I think we've moved obviously towards the corporatization of knowledge, and I think it's time that we kind of move back to that. Yeah. We move back to a more communal, collective sort of look at the institution.
Sure. Do you have anything to add on that?
I think it's kind of, there's an interesting dichotomy that just came to mind as I'm thinking about the collegiality that's inherent in sharing our work, and then the merit-based review system that a lot of universities used, and merit points and those kinds of things. So what encouragement do you have to create things together and co-create when you're in those types of situations? I don't have the answer, but it doesn't seem that they're aligned.
Yeah, if you feel like if they're at a constant race to, sort of this first past the post, get there first to claim that position, it can make it maybe intimidating to feel like you can offer your work and make it available when there's a race, and maybe you might not be the only one not participating in the race, right?
Fair enough. That's right.
You know what? I didn't know it was a race. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not a race anymore. So, so interesting. Those are some. Ask me. Are there any burning questions here from the audience that we can filter in here on this round? Yeah, go ahead.
Given what Julia talked about vetting as an instructor with not an unlimited amount of time, what are suggestions as far as how do you pick out that quality material,
right,
and how should that be vetted? Are there mechanisms in doing that?
Well, I mean, I think that there are a number of social factors available, like social tools that are available. Like you look at a system like such as Reddit, which actually has sort of a social upvote system, which could actually be used in a kind of a collective or an OER type, collective. But I think, kind of going back to what Julia was saying, is the idea of actually making this count. I mean, we review articles for textbooks and all sorts of things, which we do, and I think that certainly counts for something, but it doesn't count for enough. And I think the vetting and the sort of the collective conscience, because not to say that there's going to be, if there's a course here that's taught, that'll be taught in Regina. Sometimes you'll see this commonality. Sometimes a course might be very context specific. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for, for instance, the BC Open Text project is now extending itself, like for reviewers into Saskatchewan and Alberta. So there are reviewers of those textbooks that can now come from Saskatchewan. And so I think that idea, now there's monetary compensation in that particular piece, $250 per textbook per reviewer, which is something, but I think we still need to ingrain and institutionalize the idea of being able to create, communal or collective vetting within these particular spaces and have particular standards for that process as well. I just don't think it's quite in the things that we do, and it's not seen as something that's worthwhile. When it comes down to the selection of materials, it's one of the core things that we do as academics.
Now, I can't remember the name of the institution down in California, but when they went over to the open textbook model, they had a complete vetting system. So they actually had review forms, and they had all kinds of pieces, like how it lined up with the curriculum, so the body did that themselves, and then they rated the content. Now, I don't know if they were paid. It was under Schwarzenegger, and I want to say it begins with a C, C-L-A-T or something like that. So they had that structure. The other thing is, and we're going to talk about social media later, but I'm just going to give it a pump now. It's a great place to reach out if you need anything. For example, my MEd student who just finished her project, she was looking for a database structure that would be easy enough for a single person to learn and use. And so she reached out into Twitter and her various other connections and said, what could you suggest? And then when she ran into problems, she also floated those questions. And I've even seen Alec, which was one of the most impressive things I've seen you do, is you crowdsourced some PowerPoint slides, and then when he had them, when I went to that presentation, because not only did he just pick one, but then he used several of them to show the different conceptualizations of the it was really, really cool. I have to say that. So, yeah.
Thank you for taking the time to compliment your fellow debater. I've still got the clause.
Yes, you can't make up yet.
Let's not reconcile too early.
Yeah, that's right. We still have another blood match.
Okay. Before our last word?
That's right.
We've got to get our last word in.
Yes. Okay, so we have a last word here for each of these, on behalf of each of the presenters here before we sign off on this round. So, Alec, let's go with your last word statement.
Right. OERs occupy an important place in the education world, perhaps less because of the inherent usefulness and more because of what they represent. For one thing, OERs allow us as academics to give back to the public. In traditional models of academic publishing, knowledge is effectively double tax. We create knowledge through the use of public funds, only to give it away to private interests, and then turn away once more to buy the knowledge back through costly journal subscriptions. As academics, we must be aware of our own complicity in the forfeiture of public goods to private interests in what is perhaps the greatest heist of knowledge that's ever been known. OERs offer at least the beginning of a solution, the first steps towards a reclamation of knowledge, and that it should belong to us all. Indeed, with the incredible resources available to us through the internet, we live in a world of abundance rather than scarcity. In such a world, Eric Raymond, one of the authors of the open source movement, writes, abundance makes command relationships difficult to sustain and exchange relationships an almost pointless game. Instead, social status today is determined not by what you control, but what you gave away. OERs are a tangible manifestation of the return to academic gift economies, and in which we share rather than hoard knowledge, and we work to develop communities of openness, transparency, and collegiality.
Great, nice, very, very thoughtful. Julia, your last word.
Being pushed to take a position I wouldn't normally take with regard to OERs made me look at aspects of them that I hadn't considered previously. OERs can play a vital role in today's academic circles, from K-12 on through post-secondary. No one wants to reinvent the wheel, and OERs allow us to leverage collective intelligence, experience, knowledge, perspectives, etc. But social justice is still a concern. It's no longer just about access or hardware, but types of access and types of hardware, as well as key skills and dispositions. Who has a sufficient level of those to get at these OERs, much less create them? I'm not saying don't make them, they're valuable. But think about how to really make them accessible to the technologically disenfranchised. It's also critical to understand that if we look at the roots of OERs as coming from open software movement, it's not just about taking from open communities, but it's about giving back. Otherwise, it's just another consumer economy. OERs reduce costs and development time and can be used to make education more financially accessible in some respects, but it becomes difficult for the average educator to sort through it all. Where do the skill sets evolve, the provision of training, etc., not only for evaluating, but for creating? Part of that process is taking place here at EdMedia EXPO. If you now contribute your objects as OERs, how do you prepare yourselves to be open to constructive criticism? Should there be such critical discussion? What about government-funded resources? Who's critiquing them? Are you even able to deliver constructive criticism? And taking it one step further, are you willing to see that original OER evolve beyond you into something more with the end game of creating more effective teaching and learning opportunities? Because that's what we're all in this for, right? Crafting the best learning opportunities for our students.
Wow, okay, well, it sounds to me like there is definitely the philosophical approach to understanding and dealing with OERs coming from both sides. And certainly I think the concept of collective sharing and leveraging collective knowledge is something that should be taken into consideration when we explore the potential accessibility and of an open educational resource. And like you suggest, I think making the OER truly accessible, going further than just the collegial sharing, and making and seeking out to push it further would in some ways make it tied into your righteous way of approaching education, certainly, and making OERs at least the first step in an abundance of academic knowledge. So I think very nice thoughts in the first round, I think. Happy to have it go that way. Great. So that concludes our first round, and now we will move into the second round here of our bloodbath debate. So no blood shall. Oh, there will be blood.
It's still early.
Yeah, still early. So round two. Let it be said that social media and spaces exist, and our social media spaces contexts. So be it resolved that using social media as a learning environment is like going on safari wearing a meat hat. So Julia stands firm that today's educators are in the weeds, or maybe the latrine, if they are avoiding social media. Julia, you have 3 minutes to complete your statement, and go.
If you want to attract the lions and tigers of knowledge, networking, and expertise, bring on the meat hats, I say. If you want to connect with the local villagers, social media is your ticket. Are there trolls, privacy issues, and other concerns? You bet. But want to reach out to academic lions like Stephen Hawking and one of my personal faves, Dana Boyd? If you're watching this, Dana, I'm a big fan. You may even get within talking. You'll never get within talking, much less touching distance. But with social media, you can engage these folks in direct conversations. Are there dangers? Of course. The unworried tourist, aka student, can wander away from the group out into the open savanna rife with predators. Not the smartest move. But remember that safaris have guides who know the dangers and what to expect and have successfully navigated them time and again. Otherwise, they'd be dead. While some renegade teachers have been leading the charge in this safari, it's like the institution of education has been slacking on the job. My early experiences of Twitter were reports of bowel movements and parking spot hunts. But then I found people talking about life-shattering issues like hashtag privacy, hashtag edtech, and hashtag kittens. Or was that hashtag OER? I get those confused now.
Both cute, both cute.
According to me, gotta love when you can cite yourself, your whole perception of risk is predicated on 5 pillars: knowledge, skills and training, policies and procedures, attitudes and perceptions, and confidence. Shore up any one of these with some education and your perception of the risk change. You may say, Julia, FIPPA says I can't have students' personal data stored in servers outside of Canada. If most social media servers are outside of Canada, it would be against the law to use them with students. Wrong. First, it's okay to have public tweets that everyone could read. You don't have to hide in private groups. No one is going to go for your jugular when you post tonight's reading links. Oh, listen, Dean Jansen, Julia's tweeting about at Hoofnagel's chapter again. That reflects so poorly on our department, that level of technical knowledge. Second, don't put your students on the safari bus and tell them they're heading to the IMAX theater. Preparation is key, like why you're doing it, what personal information is involved, the privacy risks, and get consent. And do you wait till a kid is 21 and hand her the keys to the car, assuming she learned how to drive by osmosis? Just picture the havoc, let alone the repair bills and the insurance costs. Our students need developmental training in social media use. Your job as the guide is to keep those students as reasonably safe as possible. Like the Safari Guide, if you want to bring students along for a ride on social media, you need to know the territory, its risks, and how to manage them. Then you have an obligation to prepare your students, including rules for behavior, how to report concerns, and have an emergency response plan. If the lion shows up and you go screaming into the bushes, what keeps the students safe? Depending on the slowest runner being an appetizer is not a safety strategy, unless you're faster. Social media can be a platform for social activism. Remember January 25th, the hashtag and the Egyptian Revolution? Those hashtags are wickedly powerful tools for helping us make sense of unfathomable amounts of data. Some educators have these lions in the center ring performing tricks. The Plaid Avengers mock world leader accounts on Twitter. Deborah Lupton's Pinterest pin boards on sociological research methods. I'm not kidding, on Pinterest. When you begin to use social media with your students, you need to train them how to drink from the fire hose. That's how much valuable content can be found there if you know where and how to look. And you'd be amazed who you can add to your professional learning networks with social media. Honestly, I met my esteemed colleague here on social media before I ever met him face to face. I became a bit of a groupie after I'd seen his graphic, The Network Teacher, online. We later ended up teaching courses in the same program at VIU, and now we stand on the same stage. So what do we need to make good use of social media in education? More trained safari guides and fewer tourists in meat hats.
All right, nice work. Wow, so I did identify with the fire hose, drinking from the fire hose anecdote. It took me at least a couple of times to realize that you actually just need to take it from the side. Okay, well that moves on. Moving on here, we have Alec Couros in his rebuttal, and he insists that social media is for breakfast photos and teenage love affairs. What's next? Lectures at hockey rinks and seminars in the discotheque? Alec, you have 3 minutes to rebut and go.
So have you ever heard the joke about the goldfish? The one where the goldfish is swimming around his fishbowl and exclaims, "Ooh, look, a shiny castle. Ooh, look, a shiny castle. Ooh, look, a shiny castle." Our students are a little like goldfish. After being raised on a steady diet of constant stimulation and ubiquitous media, they have the attention span of a gnat and tendency to get distracted by shiny objects. However, forget the lions and tigers of social media. Don't worry, I'll get back to those in a minute. The last thing our students need is to be forced to focus and to learn in what amounts to be the world's largest playground, the internet. A study from California State University actually found that constant media use and multitasking leads to a shallower learning and impaired memory. If we insist on this perverse notion of social media as a learning environment, we are insisting that students further damage their brains to succeed in our classes. The very idea is appalling. But back to the meatheads. Sure, there are lots of shiny, distracting things on the internet, but there's also a lot of crazed, deranged people just waiting to pounce on unsuspecting learners. Haven't you seen that ad about the cyber predator? The nice young girl chatting with a teenage daughter could be anyone. A lonely old man, a psychotic serial killer, a catfishing scam artist. Heck, it could even be me on the other side of the screen. Scary, I know. As responsible educators, we just can't put our students' lives at risk. They're simply too young to know any better. And it's our job to shelter them for as long as possible in the hope that they will simply give up, become Luddites, and revert to the good old days when life was simple and the only predators were the coyotes and your creepy uncle with the weird mustache. And if the risk of cyber predators isn't enough to deter you from donning your meat hat, you should also remember the biggest predator, big data. We all know that the internet is forever and that Google, Apple, and Microsoft are hatching competing plans for world domination. Why give them extra information for their imminent takeover? And if you manage to outrun all the lions and tigers of social media that I just mentioned, think about this. There's evidence to suggest that those incredible student conversations on the web aren't all they're cracked up to be. A study at Saybrook University that looked at the use of Facebook as a learning environment actually found that Facebook's social nature seemed to predispose the dialogue of casual and affirming comments and mutual reinforcement. That's right, this revolutionary educational platform just produced a bunch of yes men. Of course, the study also found that the platform nurtured intense connections and allowed for the democratization of knowledge, but I'm not here to argue that point, am I? So to all you meat hat wearers who use social media as a learning environment, I ask, are the risks worth it? Why not avoid the lions, tigers, and middle-aged creepers? Why not keep away from the whole safari mess in the first place by sticking to the old safe friend, the closed learning management system?
All right. 15 seconds short. All right, nice work. And displaying a firm fear of the man again there. Of any man, apparently. So that was great. And that concludes the end of round one. No, that doesn't.
No, it doesn't.
Oh,
I get my turn.
Oh, you get. Oh, you want to?
I want to rebut.
You want to rebut?
I want to rebut.
So that gets into.
I'm always sides with the man. Or the one against the man.
Yeah, yeah. So we're into this is round two.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So that was the.
I'm anxious. I'm too anxious.
That was the end of round one.
Anxious.
Now we'll move into round two.
Yeah.
It's the rebate, and now Julia, you have your chance to rebut.
All right.
And go.
People hear social media and immediately imagine Facebook and Twitter the way Americans hear Canada and think snow and Mounties. Not that social networks like those two giants can't be powerful learning tools, but let's remember, folks, wikis, blogs, Pinterest, YouTube, and Flickr are all forms of social media, just like there's more to Canada than Ontario and Quebec. I would no more send a Bunny Hill skier off with my tree-dodging, jump-landing, back-scratching kids than I would take an unprepared educator into the black diamond run that is Facebook. But I could happily teach them to navigate the slopes of Twitter, Delicious, and Pinterest in a day or two, and feel confident they wouldn't commit professional hara-kiri, which I found out through Wikipedia is actually a corruption of the real term harakiri or seppuku. By the way, I learned the proper pronunciations for both of those on YouTube. I don't think I could live without social bookmarking. Imagine having all my bookmarks stuck on the hard drive of one computer, when now I can access them from any device with a browser, share them with my students, and have my students share theirs with me, at least the ones they want me to see. After all, everyone wants to get updates on what I bookmark with keywords privacy and policy, right? Tell me Wikipedia hasn't had an impact on the current state of encyclopedias and knowledge construction. Even Chesney's empirical study found the credibility of the articles there high. Social media, it's the hive brain at work.
All right, great. Nice work. All right, well, so Alec, your turn for the rebate. You have your time and go. I
like a lion stalking its prey from a distance, my colleague here is trying to lull all of us into a false sense of security by pretending that nothing is amiss, that we're not in danger at any moment of falling victim to one of the perils of social media. But fear not, my dear audience, I'm prepared to set the record straight. My colleague seems to be arguing that our perception of the dangers of social media would decrease with more skills and knowledge. But how does then she explain teenagers? Well, I know no one can actually explain teenagers, but bear with me here. Young people often lack knowledge of the potential risks of their actions online, such as posting nude pictures or illegal downloading. And yet the perception of danger is very low indeed. In fact, it is only through the development of knowledge and skills around digital citizenship that teenagers show appropriate fear of the risks of social media use. And as for social activism, sure, to use my colleague's early example, if I set enough monkeys to work trying to affect positive change through social media, one of them will eventually do something of use. But we would have to be blind to ignore the rampant perpetuation of hatred and intolerance that has spread in our online spaces. Just look at the recent example of Gamergate, where the supposed quest for journalistic integrity quickly devolved into harassment and threats to women. Are a few potentially positive acts worth the negative consequences that we see writ large on a daily basis? And finally, my colleague touts the incredible benefits of the network, but really, how accessible are those networks as tools of learning? Take Twitter, for instance. Talk about bad signal-to-noise ratio. Who wants to learn in a network where in order to access a good flow of information, you actually need to follow so many people that you need a separate tool like TweetDeck to sort through your feed for you? And the jargon. Retweets, modified tweets, hat tips, direct messages, and mentions. Talk about a steep learning curve for beginners. We put our students through that mess? Why? The bottom line is networks can work for those who have enough privilege and power to use them safely and effectively. But for everyone else, I'll stay in my armored safari van, thank you very much. You can have all of the lines to yourself.
All right, wow. Coming down on the responsibility of protection side there. Nice work, Alec, and nice work, Julia. Thank you both. And that is the rebate round. And now we enter the round 3, the last word. And in keeping on schedule here, we will remind you guys that now our 2 presenters will be responding in the next section as themselves, as the professional selves, and drop their personas that they had been arguing from. And so the first question I have here is, can social media be used to replace closed learning management systems entirely?
The question is, how can social management,
Yes,
how
sorry,
can social media, so I'm just rephrasing it a little bit.
Sure.
When I talk about working with teachers, I'm instructing teachers who are then instructing K-12 students. And in my mind, there's a scaffold that I propose be used with K-12 students in BC. And that is, initially we have something that's called digital by proxy. So digital by proxy basically means that the students can act on social media through a teacher. So you have a class account, and maybe the professor or the teacher posts on the student's behalf because they're not really that familiar with the environment. Next, you have digitally coached, where you have students in fenced environments. And you can have fenced environments. There's Twitter, there's Twitticate. Twitticate is a tool where you can set up a class account and the teacher or the instructor controls that environment and monitors things. You could have a WordPress blog that's way out there on the internet and publicly available, or you could blog on something like KidBlog. There's other tools like Edmodo. There's tools that you can restrict the amount of sharing and type of sharing that happens. But eventually, I'm not a proponent of schools keeping students forever in fenced environments. I think we eventually want to have grade 11 and grade 12 students who can move on to university, who can functionally operate in open tools like Facebook, like Twitter, as they choose to and safely.
I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, you wouldn't, if you knew you lived in a rugged environment, you would hopefully spend the time teaching kids how to climb rocks and how to survive in the wild, but instead of like, oh, don't never go outside, and then they escape and they die.
Yep.
Interesting. Did you have anything to add?
Well, okay, so to be serious on this particular point, I very much agree in that sense that it needs to be scaffolded, and I think that's one of the most important pieces around using social media. Some time ago, I created a bit of a network visualization that shows students at the early grades kind of, looking at, being helped through this. For instance, I've seen grade 1 Twitter worksheets where you have 140 squares where students will actually write in the tweets. And it's not that they have Twitter accounts, they're actually being taught media, just like the way we learned the telephone or whatever else. And I think that's really important that, adults should sometimes probably have that 140, that sort of proxy piece that allows us to think before we post, I guess. And I think that's a really important thing. But eventually, and I think it's not just simply a linear progression that we go from closed to open. It's about making that choice and having kids make sure that they have the wisdom to make those particular choices, and that they have a lot of times to be critical, to be thoughtful about what they're actually posting online. And so a teacher modeling an account, or using a classroom account at early grades, or portfolios that eventually become open, or the ability to say this post is private, this post is public, and for kids to actually have the choice in terms of what they actually do. I think that's a really important piece, and I think that's it comes down to that developmental process, but a lot of guiding and modeling that really is fundamental to all of this.
And can I add one piece to what Alec said?
Yep.
I think that it's really important for people who are avoiding having any digital footprint to rethink their strategy. Because if you're not managing your digital footprint, who is? You're leaving it open to your students to do it on Rate My Professor. Is that going to be the only digital footprint that you have? Is that what you want? Are you going to only have other people crafting it? I think it becomes very important that we start looking at ourselves very much in a kind of commercialistic way as a brand that we're managing, and so that we control our image, our audio, our video, and very much the way that we would treat a brand, with respect. And I'll leave it there.
Well, I think that's an interesting counterpoint to the previous debate topic, and one is about the well, certainly here it's about the ownership of your material, of your presentation of yourself, and learning how to navigate that responsibly, and amongst the dangers.
And to whom you want to give that control to,
yes,
and share it with.
Add to that, like last week I was in Texas, there was a room full of superintendents and directors that the question was, when was the last time you Googled yourself? That was some added, and every single one of those directors or superintendents had said, just like yesterday or a couple days ago, and they're looking at what people are saying about them, as well as what they're saying about their district. We have to remember that institutional identity is such a big part of this, and our students are creating those institutional identities. If we don't have a part in it, we are letting them define the narratives that define us, or creating the stories around us. And I think that's incredibly important to have an ability, or to have some say in the message. I think the days of controlling the message are gone, but we can certainly have a lot of say about what we do.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Any questions from the floor? Anybody here have a question that they want to throw out? You don't have to tweet it. You can ask it live. All right, well, I have another one here. So what are some of the ethical questions around asking students to engage in social media for required coursework and instruction? Okay,
so I am firmly in BC, so my training is British Columbia training, which means I am constrained by FIPA, which is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. It outlines very specific things that you need to be able to do with your students. One of them is giving them an alternative. If this is a requirement for your course, say you must be on Twitter, you can't do that. You have to give them an alternative so that if they don't want to go online. And one of the things I think that people who are very techno-loving forget is that there are reasons that students or other people would not want to be on technology that have nothing to do with fear of technology necessarily. I was up in a district where there were students in witness protection with their family. So they have a very valid reason, and it's not up to us to engage with them and say, well, why do you think that? I think you should be on there and you're gonna have to no, it's like very much when we look at getting informed voluntary consent. And that's one of the processes that you need to go through when you're asking students to go or directing them to go and create these accounts. Think of informed voluntary consent. That also means that you need to know the privacy risks, what data is going to be used, and you need to know why you're going in there. Of all the places to go around and muck about with a class just for fun, social media is not the place under law. And there were fines. Has anybody been fined yet? Not to my knowledge. We asked the assistant commissioner, and I was at OIPC presenting last week or a couple weeks ago. Nobody's been fined that we know of, but we know that the stick is there. And OIPC, the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner for British Columbia, responds to concerns and questions, and they have a gentle way of doing that. Generally, they will talk to you and say, you know, what could you do differently, like that would bring you more into line. But it's difficult, and I talked to Alec and I talked to Lisa, and I've been doing a lot of work around this in the province, especially at the K-12 level. And the work that is necessary to identify the privacy risks, like I don't know what tools you're using, but do you know how many of them have servers outside of Canada? Would you know how to find that information? Do you know how to delete the account? Can you walk your students through how to delete that account? There are certain sort of due diligence pieces that an average instructor, or at a K-12 level, an average teacher, I don't think could be expected to do. And so when I go and meet with BCTF and talk to Larry Kuhn about what I think is the future of this at K-12, I think there needs to be a specialist that a teacher or an instructor or a professor who wants to use a particular tool could go to. And then that person could help scaffold them or do a risk assessment for them and come back with some boilerplate language that they could drop into a consent form and then go off and use with their students. I'm going to stop there because I could talk on this forever.
And I think that really ties in even from your very first few points of the idea of sort of responsibility of responsible navigation, right? And knowing the dangers and knowing the pitfalls and where these gaps are is the responsibility of anybody who's engaging on their online in an online space. But then also ultimately, if you're an educator and you're asking that of your students, then you become sort of you're the map maker, and you have to you have to know where their dragons are.
And I know you guys are using Canvas. My MEd student, Brianne Quist, developed a tool. It's basically a K-12 tool. It's called the Privacy Compass. You can find it at www.privacycompass.ca. She's actually created documentation for Canvas. So there's a teacher overview in terms describing what Canvas is, and it's private, what she calls a section on privacy points, so your exposure points in working with students. There were other documents in there that would go home to a parent, but because you're dealing with adults, it's a backgrounder that talks about the risks and how those are going to be mitigated. And she has a consent form, which again is for a K-12 situation, but you could use that in a modified form with your students. And that in the OER universe, she has made all of the stuff Creative Commons. There are other tools there that you could look at.
I guess, to add to this, I mean, I've had students in British Columbia as well as, I have typically in Saskatchewan and other provinces. And it's interesting to see, FIPA as being very different than anywhere in Canada. So if you look at, we're back to the ethical issues. If you think of, 2020 report, NCT literacies, future work report, and most of these are moving towards social intelligences, network literacies, and a more connected generation. So is policy bringing down students in a particular way? I've actually seen some of the privacy restriction, it's hard to admit, but some of the things that have been, I guess, the privacy restrictions have actually created a lot of innovation in a lot of spaces. Some of the things that are happening at BC universities have forced you to be more innovative with some tools that I've seen in other places. But at the same time, we see professors very reluctant or not, educated enough to deal with this. If you go to K-12 classrooms, I work with several school districts, and you see teachers rampantly using these tools. There's a piece in Lawrence Lessig's TED Talk, in one of his very first TED Talk, and he talks about downloading of music, and he talks about one of the most important impacts that it has on kids is that this downloading of music is because everyone is living outside of the law. It creates this corrosive and corrupting effect on society. So if all these teachers are rampantly doing this and doing it anyway, we need to get to a better place of this. There are ethical issues just on that, because teachers and students will see that people are abusing copyright or perhaps not living within the sort of the limits of copyright. At the same time with social media use. So there are a number of ethical issues, whether they are used or not used, and I think that's kind of the odd thing is how do we actually find a place? Are we not connecting our students enough? Does that keep them behind when we look at a global perspective, or does the use of these things become an ethical dilemma because we're living outside of the law?
A generation of outlaws. Nice. That's right. I like it. Well, that's. Did you had anything to add?
Well, I find it interesting. Lisa knows me. She's known me a long time. I am probably one of the least conformist people that you will meet. I have now retermed myself as a rational nonconformist. Because here I am as the banner girl for FIPA in BC on K-12, and they're just like, you know, when I was at OIPC, they're just like, we like you because you don't like say, don't follow FIPA. You're like, here's how you could follow FIPA with social media tools. But I have been called like all kinds of right-winging, all kinds of things like that. And it's really important to understand that this is the constraint that we live in. And so if you decide in BC to be operating outside these parameters, you can personally be responsible, and then institutionally you can be responsible. And we don't want that to happen. You know, like, we don't like people running around with big sticks telling us what to do if you already know what to do.
Fair enough, yeah. I mean, again, responsible navigation will save you from, you know, breaking your leg or dying. Okay, well, so that brings us now to the last word, and so let's begin with Julia. Your last word.
Okay, it's actually not my last word.
Uh-oh.
I'm going to give the last word to one of my postgraduate students, Jay Ashea. I have her informed consent to use this, by the way. Teachers have a greater responsibility and a greater burden than other members of our society with respect to social media and social networking tools. Not only must we be incredibly diligent in creating and monitoring our own digital footprint, we need to instruct and direct our students in understanding the implications of their own online actions and in developing the skills and dispositions to acquit themselves honorably and responsibly in an online environment. We need to be cognizant of the law and its implications for our own and our students' practices and online activities. We must also seek to convey the skills and dispositions that students must master in order to be fully prepared for a 21st century marketplace we can barely envision. A world rife with both burgeoning possibilities and dire consequences. The breadth of our responsibilities is vast, but inevitably ours to shoulder, as we stand precariously on the front lines of the oncoming era, attempting to usher our students into that rapidly changing landscape. And I greatly thank Jay for writing that. And it was put on an assignment in an area where there wasn't even a place for this. So great for being outside the box.
Nice, thanks. So Alec, your last word.
First, I want to mention that, you know, earlier when I spoke, it's very non-characteristic, I guess, of me. So I noticed a tweet from Dr. Michelle Jacobson from the U Calgary, and me talking about the importance of learning management systems. So my digital identity will be really funny by the time I end up here. So I know, you know. So I think it's important in the first two pieces here. If you took the polar opposite of everything I argued, you probably get a good sense of where I stand on social media and network learning. The world we live in today is drastically different from the world of 10 years ago, and as the world changes, education systems must change with it or risk becoming obsolete, and you've heard that many times before. In this brave new world, new skills, proficiencies, and knowledges are required. Howard Rheingold, for instance, identifies a need for network literacies such as participation, critical consumption, and collaboration. As Dan Hengstler would say, we can't just teach youth to drive without putting them behind the wheel of a car. We can't teach our students to be digitally literate unless we provide opportunities for them to practice learning in network spaces. Of course, with great benefit comes the potential for risk. Certainly there are dangers in online spaces, but when students leave the walled garden of our closed and filtered school networks, we must ensure that they have the skills to deal with digital dangers on their own. Additionally, the digital divide, often mistaken as a simple issue of access to devices, also encompasses the divide between those who are connected and those who are not, or between those with critical digital literacies to succeed in the workplaces of tomorrow, or those with only a rudimentary level of skill. As educators, we must do our best to bridge this digital divide. For me, any risks are outweighed 1,000 times over the incredible things made possible by social networks. The affordances of social media go well beyond the learning and collaboration that they support. Indeed, perhaps more than anything, they allow for the powerful global connections on a very personal level. Ultimately, is this potential of social networks to humanize technology and indeed to humanize each other regardless of race, background, or location that can prove the most transformative benefit of all. Thanks.
Nice. Okay. Well, so it sounds like we got some really also very big picture kind of thoughts here in terms of navigating the digital landscape and the responsibility on behalf of both the students and the teachers to sort of find a way through this changing technological landscape. I think it's heard from both of you guys now, once the personas dropped, a basic kind of an agreement on the idea of the best way to secure this kind of make this new environment safe is to participate in responsible education and providing spaces and places for students as well as faculty to experience have an opportunity to play in those spaces, to learn the rules and learn the sort of restrictions and figure out where the dangers are.
Can I add one thing?
Yeah, of course.
Frequently when I go into places and talk about the applications of FIPA to social media use, there is a panic that sets in, especially among people who have already started using these tools. I'm here to tell you nobody, in my estimation, is in full compliance with this law. If you are approaching or establishing your compliance and you are triaging what your issues are, I want you to think, if you're using these tools or you know people who are using these tools, encourage them to think about their situation as seismic upgrading. The building is there. Identify your exposure points and start triaging. Which ones are the worst exposure points, address them, and move on.
Told you there would be blood. Well, one of the and I also have to have the last word.
Okay,
it's
yeah,
written
I know,
on the paper.
okay.
Well, one of the things that pulled out from both you guys is something that I think is really interesting. I think hopefully maybe we can all leave with today. There was something I pieced together, was the idea of an honorable, responsible digital citizenship. And those are basically two qualities that I would hope for a non-digital citizen as well, but certainly in understanding the way that we are presented and we present ourselves online, and the spaces and the vulnerabilities that are available, as we encourage and we have to, and you said it, you adapt or die. Which is, basically, if you don't get out there and figure out what's happening, it's gonna steamroller over you. And so, but if we can think of ourselves as creating spaces and places so students we can learn and we can understand the connectivity that can bring us all together in these social media spheres, then hopefully we can all move on and move forward being honorable and responsible digital citizens. So that brings us to the end of the debates today. I'd like to thank both Alec Couros and Julia Hengstler for being our fantastic guests. And the debate doesn't need to end here specifically today. Please feel free to continue this by contacting either Alec or Julia. Julia is available on Twitter at jhengstler on Twitter, and Alec is at Couros A on Twitter. And so feel free to throw them a tweet. And thanks very much for coming today, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.